Good evening and welcome to our online meeting for our third week of class. And in this meeting, I would like to go over some relatively new CSS3 properties, and they are the transform, transition, and the animation properties. The animation is a little bit more detailed. However, the transform property and the transition property is essentially just like any other CSS property, such as width, height, background color, where it can take several different values. And these values are essentially preset based on the nature of that property. So I have some files in this folder, and I'm going to right-click, and I will open that folder as a brackets project. And we will take a look first at transforms. So here on the right-hand side of my screen, you see this file in the browser. You can see there is a normal div element, and this div element is rotated somewhat. So the CSS transform property, now I'm in the left back in my editor here, allows us to change the nature of a static object. So it would be applied to a CSS selector, just like we would apply any other CSS property. And that selector is generally pointing to some HTML element on the page somewhere. So it would have some kind of a width and height, or it could possibly even be an image. Now, you will notice that we use these what are called vendor prefixes, or you may hear the term browser prefixes for these transitions and transform properties. So here we have MS for Microsoft, WebKit for Safari and Chrome. And the last one is the CSS3 standard syntax. And it needs to go in this order because of the inheritance of our CSS. And it doesn't necessarily need to go in this order, but the standard needs to come last because the browser reads from top to bottom and it will interpret whatever it can. So if it can read the standard is last, and that is what it will interpret. And in today's world, most of the browsers are able to interpret the CSS, the W3C standard here. So this is a property similar to a width and height property as we have set up here. And there are different types of values. One of it is rotate. And the syntax is the number of degrees and also the word degree. So if I were to save it here and refresh my page, you see that I've rotated it 200 degrees. And notice how the text now looks. It looks a little different. We can also scale. So if I were to scale this and save it, notice now it is a lot bigger. And notice that I applied this value to the last syntax here, the W3C standard. And notice that this is taking precedence here in my Chrome browser. Scale allows us to change the width and or height based on values. So 2 would be 2 times, 3 would be 3 times, etc. And it takes 2 for the width and the height. Should I just put 1 in there, and I'll change that to 3, and I'll save this and I'll reload, it applies that number to both of them. However, you have the ability to scale just the X or the Y, and that would scale it just on one size. Now notice these are static, and it just changes the nature. A transition is the ability to change a CSS property over a period of time. And transitions only happen with a hover, with the hover effect. So here we see our div, and it has a red background, and the transition is set for that div. There are various ways that we can set transitions. There are individual properties. However, I'm using the shorthand. So at minimum, you need to indicate the name of the property that you're transitioning and a time duration. So I have 2s for 2 seconds. So I am going to transition the width. Now I do have a width set already, and I'm going to transition this. Now this happens on the hover. So when the browser executes the hover, I need to have a value for width. So what's happening, that width is going to go from the original 300, which we see up here, to 800, which we see down here, over a period of 2 seconds, because that is what we have set up here. So if I were to save this and reload and hover, now you can see the width has changed, and now you can see it's going back. And this is happening over a period of 2 seconds. Now you can transition several things. Let's transition the background color. So here in my hover, I am going to uncomment this property. So this is what it's going to change to when I hover over the object. Now what I'm going to do is look at what I have originally set. There's my background color set to red. Now in this transition property, I need to let it know that I am also going to transition the background. So I need to comma separate those values, and I need to indicate that I want to transition the background, and I will also set that for 2 seconds. Now I can set it for different also. Now if I were to save this and reload, notice that I have both the background and the width being transitioned. Most of the properties that can be transitioned are those that involve some kind of unit of measure or a color. You cannot transition shorthands or font families. Now, rather than indicating the individual properties, we can just use a shorthand and we can say all. So what that will do, that will transition all of the properties that are set in our hover. And so let's test that by adding one more property. And let's see if we can transition the height. So we'll make it a little bit bigger. We'll take that to 600 pixels. I'll reload. And there we go. And there we are. So here we have transition all. It's the W3C standard. And we have these three properties being set for the hover. Now, what would happen if we didn't have the transition here? Now, these three properties would still be involved with our hover. However, it would just be like an on and off switch. There you go. It's going to just go in 1 second from this width, height, and color to the new one. And we see this, we commonly use hovers on navigation. This is where transitions really look very nice on navigation. I'm using them on large objects to make them easy to see. But on a navigation button, it would look very nice if you had a nice subtle color transition. So these are CSS transitions. They only can occur on a hover. However, we can use transform properties on transitions also. So if I were to copy in one of my transforms, and let me just so what I'm going to do, I'm going to slowly rotate this 360 degrees for 2 seconds, and maybe I'll just slow that down and make it 5 seconds. Now notice I have transition all, so I can change that, should I want to transition transform, because that is the name of the property. And there we go. We see it rotating. And when I take the cursor away, it goes back. I can also use several transforms. So if I were to save this and reload, now it is scaling and rotating at the same time over a 5-second duration. And this is just the transform property setting 2 values. One thing I would like to point out, that when you set multiple values for the transform property, they are not comma separated. However, when you set multiple transitions, they are comma separated. Just something to keep in mind there. Let's take a look at animations. Animations can occur when the page loads or on a hover. So if you look to the right, I'm going to refresh my page. The background color is red, and when I refresh, it goes all the way up to yellow, and then it flips back to red. And that is a one-time action. However, it happens when the page loads. Every time I refresh the page, I am invoking a page load here. So here's my div. It's the same div I've been using. And when you're creating an animation, there are several pieces to the puzzle. The first thing you need to do is you need to give it a name, and you need to give it a duration. At minimum, you need the name of the animation and the duration. So here we see the other vendor prefix, the Safari version, for the animation name and the animation duration. So you can work with shorthands for this. However, I'm working with the longhand because there are several different properties here, and it makes more sense to use the actual property so you understand. So we need the animation name, and I'm just calling it example. And we're going to have it 4-second duration. The animation is actually defined using the @keyframes directive. Now here we have the WebKit vendor prefix. Here we have the W3C standard. So this is the @keyframes directive, and that is followed by the name of the animation. The name can be whatever you would like. So once that is defined, and here it's defined somewhere else, it's not defined where we are applying the CSS properties to that selector. It's totally somewhere else, similar to the @fontface directive, where that's separate from applying that font face property. So here's our selector div, and this is a property animation name and a property animation duration. So this is where our animation is. And I have a from and a to. And inside I have my properties that I want to transition. Now, as I said earlier, if we look to the right, this is happening once. I also have an animation iteration count property. And that will allow me to specify a finite number of iterations, or I can use the keyword infinite. So if I were to save this and reload, my animation will continue for an infinite number of times. But notice it is a little jerky, it's going forward. We also have another very interesting property, and that's the animation direction. And remember, these are all applied to the div because the animation is happening as the page loads, just like any other CSS property would take effect the minute the page loads. So now I'm reversing it. So if I were to save this and reload, it's going to essentially go back the other way. So there are several different values. One of them is alternate, where we can change the direction of the animation. So if I were to reload the page, now we're going to see the alternate. And that's more of a smoother transition, in my opinion, than the reverse. Doesn't seem as jerky. All right, there is another animation, there's another property for animations, and that's the timing function. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you that here in W3 Schools. This is the animation timing function, and there are several different values. The default value is linear. Notice I did not specify it in my example here, so we are going to assume that it's the default. Linear timing function means that the animation will occur at a linear speed. We also have an ease, where it eases in and eases out. We also have an ease in, where it just eases in, and ease out, where it eases out, and an ease in and out for the both sides. So these are the different values that you can use for the timing function. Another thing that we can do, we can actually use percents here. So at 100%, I can have something happening. At, say, 60%, and I'm going to copy this in, and now I will do 0%. So we can move it up a little bit. We'll change this to green. So we're going to go from red to green to yellow, and let me see if I did it correctly. All right, maybe I need to make that 10%. All right, there we go. So it's only going to stay yellow for about 10% of the time here. So maybe let me change that to, say, 30. And I'll change this to 30 here. So if I were to save this, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this out here. Control X. Save this. So there are different combinations that you can also use for your animations here.